Russia rejected the offer of a Christmas truce and instead has been attacking Ukraine relentlessly. Overnight explosions were heard across the country, and emergency services worked to rescue people trapped in buildings.
The
Russian Federation is sending a message that it is raising the stakes in the...
Welcome back. Tonight, we begin with a diplomatic development that officials in Washington, European capitals, and even within the Kremlin had long feared, quietly anticipated, and discreetly prepared for, yet few believed would arrive in this form or at this speed. A development that unfolded not through months of slow, structured negotiations, but in just 48 extraordinary hours. 48 hours that may have fundamentally altered the course of the war in Ukraine. 48 hours that forced Ukraine's president onto an emergency transatlantic flight, and 48 hours that may have opened the first genuine pathway toward ending the bloodiest conflict Europe has seen since World War II. Because what Vladimir Putin did this week crossed a threshold Western diplomats had desperately hoped would never be breached. And when that threshold finally collapsed, President Volodymyr Zelensky responded not with hesitation, not with delay, but with urgency, resolve, and what aides close to his office describe as a moment of controlled desperation, fully aware that history was moving faster than anyone could comfortably manage, and that failure to act immediately could allow others to define Ukraine's future without Ukraine's voice at the center of it. What has happened over the last 2 days has changed everything: the ceasefire proposal itself, the timing of its delivery, the conditions attached to it, the message it sends to the West, and now the extraordinary sight of a wartime Ukrainian president racing across the Atlantic to meet Donald Trump at Mar-A-Lago before rival narratives could solidify, before allies could splinter, and before Moscow could frame the moment on its own terms. This is breaking news, and it represents the most significant diplomatic shift since the war began in February 2022. And tonight, we will explain exactly how it unfolded, why it matters, and what may come next. For months, there had been subtle indications that something was changing in Moscow. Not formal diplomatic overtures, not public statements, not official UN activity, but quiet signals, whispers carried through intelligence channels, backroom conversations, and movements detected by analysts trained to read what Russia does when it stops talking. Vladimir Putin, while relentlessly aggressive, has historically been predictable in his methods, following familiar rhythms, troop buildups synchronized with political calendars, media narratives escalating ahead of offensives, carefully staged appearances reinforcing his authority. But early this week, that rhythm abruptly disappeared, and for intelligence agencies in Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris, silence from the Kremlin is often more alarming than threats, because when Putin goes quiet, something significant is usually about to happen. For 3 long years, this war has advanced with grim regularity. Villages captured and lost, cities reduced to rubble, casualty numbers rising into the hundreds of thousands, while Putin consistently rejected any negotiation that did not amount to Ukraine's surrender, NATO's retreat, and Western acceptance of a redrawn European order. And every supposed peace initiative collapsed almost instantly because Moscow's terms were designed not to end the war, but to achieve through diplomacy what its military could not secure on the battlefield. That is why when reports began circulating through unofficial channels last week, suggesting a shift in Moscow's posture, veteran diplomats initially dismissed them as another performance, another tactical feint meant to divide allies or buy time. But this time was different, because the signals were not coming from Russia's foreign ministry or its habitual intermediaries. They were coming directly from Vladimir Putin's inner circle. Early Tuesday morning, European intelligence services detected unusual diplomatic communications originating from the Kremlin, communications that had not appeared in nearly 18 months, the kind of activity Russia typically reserves for moments preceding either major military escalation or a serious strategic pivot. Analysts could not immediately determine which it was, but they knew the rules had changed. By Wednesday afternoon, through a network of intermediaries, some pointing to Turkey, others to European channels, and still others suggesting discreet contact with figures linked to the incoming Trump administration, the picture became clearer. Vladimir Putin had transmitted what multiple sources now describe as a formal ceasefire proposal, not a peace treaty, not an ultimatum, not a demand for capitulation, but an offer of an immediate 90-day ceasefire, renewable if negotiations progressed, a proposal that stunned even seasoned observers. According to emerging details, Russia would halt offensive operations along the current front lines. Ukraine would do the same. Humanitarian corridors would be established in contested areas. Prisoner exchanges would resume immediately. And most controversially of all, talks would begin regarding the future status of territories currently occupied by Russian forces. This was not the Putin the world had come to expect, and Zelensky understood the implications instantly, that this could be the first real opening since the war began, but also that it could just as easily become a trap designed to pressure Ukraine into irreversible concessions. Within hours of receiving confirmation of the proposal, Zelensky moved decisively, convening his war cabinet in Kyiv, consulting senior military and intelligence leaders, and initiating direct communication with Washington, London, Berlin, and Paris before making the most dramatic move of all, boarding a plane bound for Florida. The reaction in Washington was anything but routine. Officials emerging from classified briefings described Putin's maneuver as unexpected, calculated, and potentially genuine, which paradoxically made it more dangerous because a real ceasefire proposal reshapes the entire strategic landscape, placing immediate pressure on Ukraine to respond, forcing NATO to clarify its stance, and compelling the incoming Trump administration to decide whether it will accept, reject, or redefine Putin's offer. Zelensky did not wait to see which direction that pressure would push him. Within 18 hours of the proposal surfacing, he was airborne, on what sources describe as an emergency mission to Mar-a-Lago, aimed to speak directly with Donald Trump before interpretations hardened, before Moscow could dominate the narrative. Late Thursday evening, Zelensky arrived quietly, with no advance announcement, no press presence, no ceremonial optics, just a closed-door meeting between a wartime president and a president-elect, described by those familiar with the discussion as intense, candid, and strategically vital. According to multiple officials speaking anonymously, the talks focused on three central issues: the precise substance of Putin's offer and where its hidden risks lie, the role the United States intends to play under a new administration that has promised a swift end to the war, and the question of security guarantees, because Zelensky knows better than anyone that a ceasefire without enforceable guarantees could simply allow Russia time to regroup and strike again. Sources indicate the conversation was frank and occasionally tense, but ultimately constructive, with Zelensky making clear that Ukraine is prepared to negotiate but will not surrender its sovereignty, and Trump emphasizing his desire for a deal that ends the bloodshed without rewarding aggression. Crucially, both reportedly agreed that Putin's proposal must be tested. If genuine, it could save countless lives. If deceptive, it must be exposed quickly. What followed may be just as consequential as the meeting itself. Intelligence analysts now believe Putin's ceasefire proposal was intended as a test of Western unity after the U.S. election, a probe to see whether political transition in Washington would weaken support for Ukraine or pressure Ukraine into accepting unfavorable terms. But Zelensky inverted that strategy, seizing the initiative, shaping the conversation directly, and demonstrating that Ukraine remains an active, capable, and strategically agile actor rather than a passive recipient of great power decisions. European leaders moved rapidly, issuing coordinated statements of support. NATO adjusted its communication posture, and reports suggest Moscow was caught off guard by the speed and precision of Ukraine's response. British and American intelligence services reportedly intercepted communications indicating surprise within the Kremlin at how quickly Zelensky had acted, turning what was meant to sow division into a moment of renewed coordination. This was not merely a diplomatic visit, it was a strategic repositioning, a signal that Ukraine understands the shifting political realities and intends to remain central in shaping its own future. Putin once believed this war would be over in days, that Kyiv would fall, that Zelensky would flee, and that Western unity would fracture under pressure. Yet 3 years later, NATO has expanded, Europe remains aligned, U.S. support continues across administrations, and the Russian president now finds himself offering a ceasefire under mounting internal strain from military losses, economic pressure, and competing demands from hardliners, pragmatists, oligarchs, and commanders alike. Whether this moment marks the beginning of the war's end or merely another dangerous chapter remains uncertain, but one thing is clear tonight: the last 48 hours have reshaped the battlefield, not with tanks or missiles, but with urgency, strategy, and a race to